I've been carrying this secret for 37 years, and the night it finally came out, I was sitting at the wrong end of a very long dinner table, holding a glass of Bordeaux I couldn't taste, listening to my son's future in-laws decide exactly what kind of woman I was. They weren't wrong about everything. I'll give them that. My name is Dorothy Hale, and at 64 years old, I've gotten very good at being easy to overlook. I'm the kind of woman people describe as sweet when they can't think of anything else to say. I wear comfortable shoes. I bring homemade pie to neighborhood gatherings nobody asks me to host. I laugh at the right moments and stay quiet at the ones that matter. After my husband passed 3 years ago, I got even better at all of it because there's nothing quite like grief to teach you how small a person can make themselves. My husband Raymond had been the one who filled rooms. 38 years together, and I never once had to figure out how to walk into a party alone. Because Raymond was always already halfway across it, shaking hands, throwing his head back laughing, pulling me along by the wrist. When he died of a stroke on a Wednesday morning in April. Just like that, between breakfast and lunch, I didn't just lose my husband, I lost the person who kept reminding me I was worth noticing. Our son, James, was 36 when it happened. He'd already been living in Seattle for years by then, working in aerospace engineering for a firm that does contracts for companies whose names I recognize from the news. He flew home for the funeral, stayed 2 weeks, and then flew back to his life. I understood. I told him to go. I meant it, mostly. 2 years ago, James called to tell me he was serious about someone. Her name was Yuna, and her family had come from South Korea when she was 8 years old. Her father, Dr. Kwan, was a retired cardiologist. Her mother, Helen, ran a small but highly regarded Korean skincare business with a loyal following online. They were warm people, James said, family-oriented, close. I was happy for him. I want to be clear about that. James deserved someone who loved him, and from everything he described, Yuna did. She was a biomedical researcher, quietly brilliant. The kind of person who listened more than she spoke and remembered everything. The few times I'd met her before that evening, she'd been perfectly kind to me. Not warm exactly, but kind. There's a difference. The problem was never Yuna. The problem was that I'd become a footnote in my own son's story, and I had no one to blame for that but myself. The dinner was Dr. Kwan's idea. James and Yuna had been together 3 years, and there was an understanding between them, even if no formal engagement had happened yet. Dr. Kwan wanted to bring the families together before things went further. He'd invited a colleague of his from Korea, a Dr. Park, who was visiting from Seoul for a medical conference, and his wife. James called me on a Thursday to let me know, "Mom, it's at their house in Bellevue. Saturday at 6. He paused. "You'll come, right?" "Of course I'll come. And maybe, dress up a little. Not that you don't always look nice, but it's kind of a formal thing. I know how to dress for dinner, James. I know, Mom. Yeah. Okay, good." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets on late Thursday afternoons when the light goes gold and slanted through the back window and there's nothing but the sound of the refrigerator humming. I looked at the chair across from me, the one Raymond always sat in, and I thought about the version of me that had existed before I started trying not to take up space. I hadn't told James about Soul. I barely told anyone, really, except Raymond. It had been so long ago that it felt like a story about someone else entirely. A younger Dorothy who had been brave in ways I could no longer quite believe. I was 24 when I went. It was 1986, and I had a degree in linguistics from a state university in Ohio that nobody seemed particularly impressed by, including me. I'd been offered a position teaching English through a program that placed recent graduates in South Korean public schools. I almost didn't take it. My mother's thought I'd lost my mind. My college boyfriend told me I was throwing my life away. I went anyway. I was placed in a mid-sized city called Daejeon, in a school where most of the teachers had never spoken to an American before. I was 24, homesick, and absolutely electrified. I'd studied linguistics because I loved the architecture of language. The way grammar systems revealed something true about how people saw the world. Korean broke open everything I thought I knew. The honorific levels, the way age and relationship were baked directly into every verb ending, the way context shaped meaning in ways English never quite managed. I stayed for 7 years. I became fluent not from a classroom, but from the markets and the teacher's room and the family down the street who adopted me as a kind of honorary daughter and fed me on holidays and argued with me about everything. I learned not just formal Korean, but the comfortable, faster, half swallowed Korean of people who'd known each other for decades. The regional inflections, the idioms that didn't translate, the particular rhythm of conversation between people who trusted each other. I came home because my father got sick, and then I met Raymond at a church fundraiser in Columbus 3 months after I arrived, and that was that. I put Korea away like a winter coat at the end of the season, folded carefully, stored somewhere I knew it would be there if I needed it. And slowly, over 30 years of Ohio suburbs and school pickups and neighborhood association meetings, I stopped needing it. Or I told myself I didn't. James didn't know. When he was small, I taught him a few words. Hello? Thank you, I'm hungry. The way parents teach children party tricks. But I never explained the depth of it. Never sat him down and said, I spent 7 years of my life becoming someone fluent in a language and a culture that will one day matter to you. It had seemed like bragging, and then it had seemed irrelevant. And then so much time had passed that bringing it up felt strange. The drive to Bellevue on Saturday took 40 minutes. I spent most of it talking myself out of turning around. The Kwan house was beautiful. A large craftsman-style home on a quiet street with a garden that had clearly been tended for years. Helen answered the door before I'd finished knocking, and her smile was the practiced, pleasant kind that doesn't give much away. Dorothy, welcome. Please come in. James is already here. The living room was full of people. James found me immediately and came over with that particular relief on his face that made me feel like both a comfort and a burden at once. Mom, you look great. Come meet everyone. Dr. Kwan shook my hand firmly. He was a precise, composed man with good posture and the manner of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room. His colleague, Dr. Park, was warmer, with an easy laugh, and his wife, a woman named Sujin, had brought flowers from the garden of wherever she was staying and offered them to Helen with a small bow. Yuna was by the fireplace talking to James's colleague from work who'd also been invited, for reasons I didn't entirely follow. She looked beautiful and a little nervous, and when she came over to greet me, she held my hands in both of hers for a moment in a way that felt genuinely warm. I liked her. I'd always liked her. That was never the complicated part. We moved to the living room for drinks. I was guided, gently but unmistakably, to a chair that was slightly outside the center of the conversation. Not excluded, never that directly, but positioned the way you position a decorative piece of furniture. Present. Accounted for, not expected to do much. The conversation moved easily between English and Korean. Dr. Kwan and Dr. Kwan. Park spoke to each other primarily in Korean, with occasional English for the benefit of the room. James, who spoke no Korean whatsoever, smiled and nodded with the particular, determined goodwill of someone trying very hard at a party where he doesn't know the language. I sipped my wine and listened. Helen was talking to Sujin in Korean. The conversation light at first. The flight from Seoul, the hotel, the weather in Seattle, which had been unusually warm. Then Helen's voice dropped slightly, the way voices do when a conversation becomes more private, even though the room hasn't changed. She said in Korean that Yuna was a wonderful daughter, that she had never once caused her parents worry, that she had always known how to honor her family. Sujin agreed warmly. Then Helen glanced toward me, just briefly, the quick sideways look of someone checking whether they're being understood, and continued. James is a good man, she said. We're satisfied with him. But his mother... She paused. She's very distant. Cold, maybe. Yuna says she never reaches out, never initiates. In Korea, the mother-in-law is the heart of the family. If she doesn't make effort, it creates distance in the marriage. It's already a concern. I kept my face completely still. I took a slow sip of wine. Dr. Park's wife Sujin nodded thoughtfully and said she supposed American family culture was simply different. Not better or worse, just different. Less emphasis on the older generation staying involved. Helen said, gently but with clarity, that she worried the distance came from something more than culture. That a mother who doesn't fight to stay in her son's life perhaps doesn't value family the way she should. Dr. Kwan, from across the room, said something quieter that I had to concentrate to catch. He said that in his experience, people who had lost a spouse sometimes turned inward in ways that were permanent. That grief could make people selfish without them realizing it. He said it without cruelty. That almost made it harder to hear. Across the room, James was laughing at something Dr. Chris Park had said, tilting his head back the way Raymond used to, and I watched my son not know that his future was being quietly evaluated through the lens of his mother's silence, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, exactly, something older than anger. We moved to the dining room. The table was set with obvious care, Korean dishes alongside some Western ones, a beautiful mix that spoke of effort and welcome. I was seated at the far end, between Sujin's husband and an empty chair that someone had apparently decided I didn't need company in. The food was extraordinary. I ate without tasting it. Helen continued, midway through the main course in Korean to Sujin. She said that she had tried, that she had invited Dorothy to things and received polite excuses, that Yuna had reached out and gotten one-word replies, that it wasn't a question of the family not trying. This was not entirely untrue. I had said no to things. I had answered texts with brevity because I was afraid that longer answers would reveal how desperate I was to say yes. I had perfected the art of seeming self-sufficient because I had decided, somewhere in the 3 years since Raymond died, that needing people was the same thing as burdening them. Sujin said, carefully, that perhaps it was worth one more honest conversation before drawing conclusions. Helen said she wasn't drawing conclusions, just sharing her worry. She wanted this to work. She wanted her daughter to have a good marriage with a strong family foundation on both sides. She looked at me then, right at me, for a full moment, and I watched her decide, again, that I couldn't understand a word she was saying. I set my fork down. I picked up my wine glass. I took one breath. And then I said, in Korean, not the careful, textbook Korean of a language class, but the easy, lived-in Korean of someone who had once spent 7 years buying vegetables in Daejeon and arguing about grammar with retired school teachers. I said, quietly but clearly, so that the people nearest me heard it first. I think there may be some things I should explain. The silence moved outward from my end of the table like a wave. Helen's face went the particular still of someone whose brain is working very fast. Dr. Kwan's chopsticks stopped moving. Sujin blinked. James looked between me and everyone else, with the expression of a man watching a film in a language he doesn't speak and trying to read the subtitles. Mom, he said. I kept my eyes on Helen. I said, still in Korean, that I wanted to apologize first. Not for understanding, but for not saying anything sooner, and for giving everyone, including my own son, the impression that I was someone who had chosen distance as a preference rather than a fear. Helen said, barely above a whisper, You speak Korean. I lived in Daejeon for 7 years, I said. I taught at Daesung Middle School and Cheongnam Girls High School. I learned from my neighbors and from the women at the market near my apartment, and from a retired professor named Mrs. Marget. Oh, who corrected my pronunciation every Tuesday and Thursday over barley tea. My Korean isn't perfect anymore, but it was once. Dr. Kwan leaned forward. He said slowly that he was from Daejeon. I know, I said. Yuna mentioned it. I used to take the bus to the Central Market on Saturday mornings, the one near the old train station. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in a different tone than he'd used all evening, that the market was still there. I turned to Helen. I said that I knew what she had said about me, and that I understood why she'd said it, because from the outside I must look exactly like what she'd described. Distant, cold, not fighting hard enough to stay in my son's life. But I wanted her to know something. I said that 3 years ago I lost my husband of 38 years on an ordinary Wednesday morning with no warning, and that the grief of it had done something to me that I hadn't known how to name until just recently. That I had started to believe the kindest thing I could do for James was to take up less space, to need less, to make myself manageable, tidy, the kind of mother you check in on occasionally and find fine. I had confused not burdening people with not mattering to them, and I had gotten so good at performing independence that even I had started to believe it. My voice held steady. I was proud of that. I said that I was not cold. I was lonely in a way that had become so familiar I'd stopped recognizing it as loneliness. I was a woman who had once spent 7 years on the other side of the world, learning to belong somewhere, and who had slowly, over decades of ordinary life, forgotten that she knew how to do that. The table was completely silent. Then I looked at James and I switched to English, because he deserved to hear this part. I said that I had been so afraid of being a burden to him that I had made myself a stranger instead, and that was its own kind of failure. That his father would have told me to stop it. That Raymond would have shown up at James's apartment with coffee and absolutely refused to leave until they'd talked for 3 hours, and I had decided instead to send brief texts and say I was fine, and wonder why the distance kept growing. James's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. I said, I'm not fine. I missed your father every single day, and I miss you, and I'm sorry I made you think I did it. He was out of his chair before I finished the sentence. He came around the table and put his arms around me from behind, the way he used to when he was small, and I felt him press his forehead against my shoulder for a moment before straightening up. The room gave us that. When he came back to his seat, Una reached over and took his hand. She was looking at me with something I hadn't seen from her before. Not polite warmth, but actual recognition, like she was meeting me for the first time. Dr. Kwan cleared his throat. He said in Korean that he owed me an apology, that he had said something earlier. He paused, checking to be certain I'd caught it, about grief making people selfish. He said it had been an unfair assessment of a situation he hadn't understood. I said that he wasn't entirely wrong. Grief had made me selfish in certain ways, just not the ways he'd meant. Helen stood up and came around the table and sat in the empty chair beside me, the one that had been empty all evening. She touched my hand and said that she was sorry, that she had filled in the blanks with the wrong story. I told her that was easy to do. She said after a pause that she had lost her own mother-in-law before coming to America, and that it had left a hole in her family she'd never quite said out loud, that she had always wanted to do better for her own daughter, that she had perhaps overcompensated. We sat with that for a moment. Sujin, from across the table, said something that made Helen laugh for the first time all evening, a real laugh, startled and warm. She said that this was the most interesting dinner party she had attended in 20 years of accompanying her husband to conferences, and that she intended to tell everyone about it. Dr. Park was nodding. He said to James in English that his mother was remarkable and that he should tell her so more often. James said, I know. I haven't been doing a good enough job of that. The conversation that followed was entirely different from the one that had preceded it. Dr. Cher. Kwan asked me about Daejeon in the 80s, and we discovered we had both, at different points, been regulars at the same small bookshop near the University District that had closed sometime in the 90s. He remembered the owner. I remember the owner's wife, who used to leave a particular poetry collection on the front table every spring. Helen asked me about the schools I taught in, and then about how I'd learned the dialect, and then with a sidelong smile, whether I'd found the regional accent difficult at first. Impossible, I said, and she laughed. Una sat across from me and asked how it ended up in linguistics, and I found myself telling a version of my own history I hadn't told in years. Not the edited, apologetic version I'd gotten used to, but the real one. The girl from Ohio who was electrified by the architecture of language, the one who bought a one-way ticket on a teacher's stipend and figured the rest out when she got there. Who learned a whole country's worth of history and idiom and humor by living inside it. James was listening. He had the expression of someone hearing a story he'd been trying to find for a long time. After dinner, while Helen and Sujin brought out dessert and Dr. Kwan and Dr. Park moved to the sitting room, Yuna touched my arm and asked if I'd come to the kitchen for a moment. We stood by the window over the sink, where the herb plants were lined up on the sill. Cilantro, green onion, perilla. And she said, quietly, that she had wanted to reach out to me more than she had. That she'd been afraid I didn't want her to. That James had told her I preferred my independence, and she'd taken it at face value. I said that James thought that because I had told him so. She nodded slowly. I said that I would very much like to start over, if she was willing, that I wanted to know her. Not the version I'd assembled from a distance, but the actual person, the researcher, the daughter, the woman my son had chosen. She said she'd like that. Then she said with a small smile that she'd had no idea about any of it. I said that was somewhat by design, but that I was finished with that particular design. When I found James on the back porch later, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the garden in the dark, he didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did I. We stood next to each other the way we used to stand when he was a teenager and something had happened that was too large for immediate words. Then he said, I didn't know about Soul. I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell me? Because it started to feel like a past tense person, I said. And then so much time passed that bringing it up felt like showing someone a photograph of yourself from before they knew you. Strange. Like bragging about someone you used to be. He was quiet. Then he said, That's not strange, Mom. That's your life. I know, I said. I'm remembering that. He put his arm around my shoulders. He said he wanted to hear all of it. Everything I hadn't told him. Naples. No. Soul. All of it. He wanted to know who I was before I was his mother, and also while I was his mother, and he was sorry it had taken this long for him to ask. I leaned into him the way I hadn't let myself lean into anyone since Raymond died. He said that he'd been leaning on me his whole childhood and that he'd gotten so used to me seeming solid and self-contained that he'd forgotten to check whether I was okay. That wasn't an excuse. He knew it wasn't. But he wanted me to know he saw it now, and he wasn't going to unsee it. We went back inside when Helen called us, and I spent the rest of the evening in the center of the table instead of the edge of it, and it felt both strange and exactly right, the way it feels when you recover a habit you lost. Driving home, I took the longer route without deciding to. The city lights were bright and the roads were quiet, and I had my window down a little because the air was warm for the time of year. On the radio, a song came on that Raymond had loved, and I let myself feel that fully instead of putting it somewhere manageable. My phone buzzed at a stoplight. James, love you, Mom. Coming for dinner Sunday? Then Una, it was so good to talk tonight. I hope we can do it again soon. Many times. Then Helen, which surprised me. Dorothy, I'm glad you were here. I think maybe we should have coffee this week. There is much I'd like to understand better. I sat in my driveway with the engine off for a while. The house was dark except for the porch light I'd left on, which Raymond had always said was the kind of habit that would run up the electric bill. I'd kept doing it anyway because a lit porch meant someone was expected home. I thought about the woman who had gotten on a plane to Seoul at 24 with a linguistics degree and a head full of nerve, who had learned to belong somewhere by refusing to stay on the edges of it, who had spent 7 years becoming fluent in an entire way of seeing the world and then quietly put it away like it had never happened. I thought about how long I'd been waiting for permission to be that person again. Raymond would have laughed at me for waiting. He would have said, Dorothy, nobody's going to hand it to you. You have to just go ahead and be it. He would have been right. He was annoyingly right about things like that. I texted James back, love you. Yes to Sunday. Tell Una to pick something she wants to learn to cook. I texted Helen, coffee sounds wonderful. Thursday? I sat there another moment in the quiet of my own driveway, and I thought about the version of myself that had arrived at that dinner table tonight, the one who sat at the edge of the room and performed invisible. And I thought about the version that had left it. They were the same person. That was the thing nobody tells you when you've made yourself small for long enough. You don't actually disappear. You just get very good at pretending you have. I picked up my keys and got out of the car, and I walked into my house and I turned off the porch light, not because I was done expecting things, because I was already home.